Welcome to the TCG Compass Podcast, presented by Ambr Grading, a mostly weekly discussion on trading card games and the people who love them.
Hi there.
Hello.
On today's show, we're going to be talking about proxies.
Don't you mean counterfeits?
Or playtest cards.
Yeah, so as a disclaimer, we're not talking about any legal interpretation of cards that could be proxies or counterfeits. None of this is meant to be taken as legal advice. I wouldn't recommend taking legal advice from me anyway, as I'm not a lawyer. And we're not doing this in any means of trying to infringe on intellectual property or make any recommendations to you regarding intellectual property. But we do think that proxies or playtest cards are a hot topic right now. And part of that is fueled by the Wizards of the Coast reprint policy, which basically says that if a card is just Sharpied on, it can be used to test cards. But there's other interpretations of that as well. What are your thoughts, Mark?
Well, I think that proxies have a place in the game, functioning as playtest cards, and Wizards has an official stance on players' ability to use playtest cards as long as they can't be mistaken for real, legitimate Magic cards, even by the untrained eye. You know, somebody just kind of taking a look at the card, you shouldn't be able to confuse it for a real card, and as long as you can't, then it absolutely has a place to assist players with playtesting and giving certain cards and decks trial runs before they spend money on it. Chuggy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm a lot in the same boat. Like, I remember, when I was a kid, we would take those World Championship deck blank cards that have the gold border on them, because it's, it has an empty art box and an empty text box. You could write in kind of the name of the card. I also found, sleeved cards that were just turned around, and we would take a piece of binder paper, rip it up and then write on it and then slide it in so we didn't damage any cards, So I've kind of historically used these proxies to play test. And like you said, do it before investing in, a play set of something to see if this is the kind of deck that I wanted to play. And, as long as there's a clear difference, that you're not trying to pass this off as a real card, and it's really obvious that you're not, it's cool.
Yeah, so there's been some stores that even allow tournaments that have a certain number of proxy cards in it. And under the WotC statement here, it says that Wizards of the Coast has no desire to police playtest cards made for personal, non-commercial use, even if that usage takes place in a store. Now, I mean, that could probably indicate a lot of different things. Maybe it means they're allowed in the lowest level of sanctioned tournaments. Maybe it doesn't. Probably doesn't. But what are your guys' takes on seeing a handwritten card in a deck in a Friday Night Magic event or something like that?
Well, I mean, there's it kind of depends. I think all the players would need to know beforehand that it's an event that allows for those types of proxies, and it may be the only way that players can get exposed to certain game types. It's really hard to have somebody who's normally playing a Friday Night Magic event and either playing limited or standard or even modern and say, hey, we're going to do vintage this weekend. Bring your vintage deck. And it's like, well, I don't have a vintage deck. I have a legacy deck, but I don't have any power and this and that. And, as long as players that are in the event beforehand know that there's going to be a 10 proxy limit or something like that, and everybody that is joining in and paying an entry fee to play in the event knows that, then I think it's generally okay.
Yeah, personally, I like the proxy limit. I've definitely played against a legacy Oops All spell deck where every single card was proxied. And that was a little frustrating because you're just kind of they're playing solitaire basically, and you're just sitting across from them watching them play solitaire with a deck that's completely proxied. But, for especially those older formats, even Legacy, those decks' values are in the thousands of dollars, and I can understand it's unwieldy to cart around one, if not more, Legacy decks at a store. It poses a risk of theft and all kinds of things. So it's I can understand having some sort of proxy limit for a tournament. just because of it also gets people into the format, right? Like a ton of people play Commander and they have dual lands and things like that, but they might not have like a play set of City of Traders or, Mox Diamonds or something like that, and something that they'll pick up over time. But yeah, having that exposure, as we've even seen online, right? The number of players that play Historic, it's not really a paper format, but because the exposure is there and the availability of cards is there, it's a really healthy, like bustling format where a ton of people play it.
Yeah, and I think it's. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say that it's important too, and we don't want to get too deep into this right now, but understanding that some of Wizards' other policies, specifically dealing with the reserve list, kind of inform how a lot of players feel about proxies, right? And so it's going to be hard for me to tell somebody, oh, we're not going to play Vintage, or I don't want to play Vintage without proxies against you. And yeah, I want you to go out and spend $10,000 on a play set of Mishra's Workshops before we can actually sit down and play for fun, when there's no opportunities for players to obtain cards for that format at an affordable rate at this point.
Yeah, speaking of that, Grant, what do you think about the impacts on the financial markets for cards with, because of playtest cards or proxies, not counterfeits?
I think that it definitely has an effect, right? But it's one of those things where there's a threshold, and it's a question on the individual's part. If a card hits a certain price threshold, that it's no longer feasible to pick one up, right? When dual lands were like $70, $80, $90 for, the non-blue duels, a lot of people would be like, yeah, that's not a exorbitant amount of money to spend on it. But then you kind of look at the prices today, if you're kind of coming into the game or coming into a format where it does require dual lands, there's a lot of like, do I want to spend $1,000 on a play set? Now it's like actual, factual, like real money in it. So does it impact it when people are using, like artists, really nice proxies that don't infringe and everything? It does, because there's just like less people who will buy them. But, just kind of like it's tricky territory, right? Because I think everything has a threshold. There's been price thresholds that have been shattered in my mind, where when Underground Sea hit $1,000 a card twice now, that blew my mind. I was like, this has got to cap out at like 750 or 800 maybe, and then it just like rises past that. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens kind of moving forward if we see the growth, especially in reserve list prices. But people are both investing in it, but also like buying it to play, and it's really causing a shortage on cards that have a decreasing supply over time.
Couldn't you see it going both ways? And I'll get your take on this, Mark. Couldn't playtest cards maybe allow people to sample with decks, find out exactly what they like, and then actually be more determined to buy a set of cards at a higher price because they know they really enjoy the deck?
It could be.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what Wizards' actual policy wants players to do, right? Their intention was for players to be able to use playtest cards to figure out if it's something that they wanted to. And Chuggy, you mentioned earlier about the exposure for formats. And so if somebody can't break into a format because of the price ceiling or isn't sure if they want to invest in something, maybe having an opportunity to play with the deck, even if it uses proxies, and then they have a blast piloting it, and then they might go out and decide to invest in the format that they were really skeptical on dropping that kind of money on before they had a chance to see what it was like to actually play. So there's that too, the potential format growth based on card availability, and proxies can help to enable that.
Now, this is definitely a tangent, but in the last few weeks, I've been trying out every single TCG I can get my hands on just to see what's out there, what I really enjoy. And out of all of them, a standout has actually been Digimon. It's just come out about a year ago. It's a really cool game. I bought some sample decks and tested them out. But if you told me to spend $100 or $200 on a deck, a month ago for Digimon, I would have said no. Like, Absolutely not. But now that I've played the game a little bit and I actually really enjoy it, I got a chance to sample it, even with really inexpensive cards. I could actually see spending $100 or $200 on a deck because I know I'll enjoy it. And I kind of see that playtest cards do that same thing for either eternal formats or even standard, where, like I typically don't buy standard decks because I know that it's going to rotate soon. I'm not going to get a lot of value out of it. I only play maybe one standard event a week at most. But not too long ago, I got to play test with a mono white deck. It was actually on Arena, and it actually encouraged me to go out and buy the physical cards because, I really enjoyed this deck, and I would actually enjoy piloting it in a real life tournament. But to try and bring it back a little bit, somebody mentioned, artist proxies, where the card has user created art, and it might say something that indicates the name of what card it might be. If it was Mox Ruby, it might just say Ruby. How do you guys feel about that as a form of a proxy rather than just a handwritten card? We start with Mark.
Yeah. Okay, anything that allows the player to get the experience, to get meaningful reps in with the deck to see whether or not they enjoy using it, whether it is a proxy that has full Oracle text on it, or if it's, like you said, one of those the user generated ones that has the specific fan art and it just says Ruby, and they sort of try to skirt any IP flavor or whatever that might be on there just to kind of make their own thing. It still accomplishes the same thing, and as long as it's not, as long as the card can't be mistaken for a legitimate card, and the intent is still there, which is just to use it as a playtest card and sit down at the kitchen table with your friends and be able to play a format that maybe some of them are a little bit more entrenched in, and you're just trying to sample it out and see how it goes. It kind of does the same thing for you that any one of those designs would do.
Absolutely. And Grant, when do we cross the line from proxy into counterfeit?
It's when it's really trying to pass as a real card, right? I mean, there's numerous Facebook groups that are counterfeit detection where people will take high-res scans and, looped photos of cards, that try to pass off as real. A lot of them do come from overseas. And, in our little Hawaii community, we have a guy that does purchase them to use as basically research, right? So kind of know what we're up against. So we know both what's in the card pool, which cards that they are printing and trying to pass off as real, as well as kind of the discrepancies, whether it's in the stock and the feel, whether it's in the green dot test, whether it's in the foil sticker that they've gotten really good at counterfeiting now, whether it's the order that the card is printed in to see where the borders and things kind of come together, the set symbol and whatnot. So I think the real definition, working definition that I use is if it's a card that is trying to be passed off as a legitimate card, that's when you're in counterfeit territory.
Mark, would you add on to that at all, or do you think that that's 100% true?
And I think it's important to indicate the intent, and not just for the primary creator of the card, but for anybody that might wind up with that proxy in their hand. Like we've been saying, if it can't possibly be passed off as a real card, right? Because it has an alternate back, it has an art and frame combination that's never been used before. The original creator didn't do it to create money, and if it found its way into somebody else's hands, they wouldn't be able to take it to and have any nefarious purpose. They can't trade it or sell it as a real card because it just can't possibly be mistaken for one. And I think that's the important distinction for me between where a card passes from a proxy or a playtest card into a counterfeit card. Is could somebody who's less familiar with those advanced detection techniques, Chuggy, that you're talking about, even without those tools, looped photos and understanding card weight and the surface feel and all that, even without that, it still would never be mistaken for a real card. That's when it's truly a playtest card.
Right. I would even take it one step further, and that any proxy should say on it somewhere that this card is a proxy and it's not for resale. I think what that does then is, let's say like somebody's mom is trying to buy cards. She might not even know that Magic the Gathering only has one back, or Pokemon only has, one back for its English printing, and might not even know that a different back is means that it's not a real card. But if it actually says somewhere on there, this is proxy, this is not for resale, then, it kind of closes the loop on any chance for that person to be like, well, I didn't know,
yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Let's see here. So, we all know that counterfeits have gotten really good in the last few years. Some of them are, indistinguishable when they're in a sleeve. But in my experience, just the slightest bit of scrutiny and you can really start pulling apart a counterfeit from a real card without a lot of trouble. I haven't found any that have passed more than, 2 or 3 of the tests that prove whether a card is real or not. How about your experience, Chuggy?
They've gotten pretty good. Like, I've seen a newer gen tinker that the only thing that really throws you off is the texture of the card. The card's just glossy enough where you're like, this can't be real. And then, that kind of throws you down the rabbit hole where you start checking for other things. But like, if they got the texture even a little bit closer, people would not know. And Tinker is not an expensive card either. But like Tinker, people wouldn't suspect that it was a counterfeit card. Now, I think the thing that kind of like throws a wrench in it now is the print quality deviation across print centers for a lot of the more modern cards is starting to like make it harder to detect counterfeits too, because the variation is pretty high, right? If we look at sets like Kaladesh, you look at the Japanese printer, the Japanese language Kaladesh that came out, all of their colors are muted and it has like this faded look, right? But then you look at the American printer and it's this very vibrant, saturated color to it. There's been times where the color of the core has been different in the past, and then the print variation in even masterpieces, right? You look at masterpieces where some parts are matte, some parts are glossy, depending on whether you have a European version, APAC version, or an American version. So it's like, that makes it a lot harder because, everybody kind of has to keep up on the collector side of things, to make sure that you're getting something that's legit. Just because there's been an introduction of a lot more print variation in, the last 5 to 10 years that really wasn't as big of a problem before. Like the biggest time in my mind is like when we had fourth and alternate fourth. Like, that's an example of a pretty large, variation in printing, but, it's become more and more common nowadays.
Yeah, I think at the point when Wizards of the Coast started relying on Japanese printers, primarily is when we started seeing a big uptick in variations. I think it was M21 or M20, one of them. It didn't pass the majority of the typical tests that you would do. And they're all real cards, but, I was one of those guys who, when I would get a new card in, I would do the bend test, and, I've done this with Library of Alexandria's and Power, where you just go edge to edge and then you pop it back. It's no problem. But I did that with a full art Ugin, and the very first time it just creased right through the middle, and I was like, oh my God, this card's fake. So I started doing some more research on it, and it's like, these cards have different core, they have different, surface material, they have different ink, and they all crease when you use the bend test. So it's at that point when I was like, all right, bend test is out. It's no longer reliable.
Rip Ugin.
Yeah. So I also decided at that point never to use the bend test on any card ever, just because it's technically a destructive test. You could destroy cards without intending to, because the 200th time somebody does a bend test on it, it's probably going to crease whether it's real or not. So it's not a good test to do. Yeah.
What color smoke does it produce when we light it on fire? I don't know. We'll see if it's real when we're done.
Yeah, the tear test is not a good test either. I don't know why people do that. And then for some people out there, blue core is predominant in Magic cards, but not all of them. So
there's also blue core proxies now too.
Yeah, there are blue core.
Or counterfeits, I should say.
That core you're seeing is actually an adhesive material. It's not a layer of paper. So, yeah, it can get a little tricky if you don't know all the ins and outs of how a card is constructed and how it's printed and where it was printed. And a lot of that stuff is really protected trade secrets. So it's not like, you could go out and do a lot of research and you might be able to find some information, but unless you do it every day, I wouldn't rely on some of those tests as a primary indicator of whether a card is real or not. Yeah. Pokemon actually does a really good job of making cards that are difficult to fake well. Some of the other newer games like Final Fantasy TCG, they're made with a really awesome substrate that just, it's really hard to copy. It's textured on the back. It's like kind of plasticky. The more complicated the materials are, the harder it is for a card to be counterfeited.
Anachronism is a card game that also had a very unique card stock. Very difficult to copy and replicate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're coming up on the end of our time here. Mark, where can our viewers find you?
Easiest place is over on Twitter at WTWLF123, or you can find me on MTG Salvation.
Awesome. And Grant, how about you?
You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Chuggy_Bear.
Awesome. And to get in touch with us, see the episode description or head over to ambergrading.com/TCG Compass. We'd love to hear from you.
That's our show for today. Thanks for joining us for the TCG Compass podcast. I've been your co-host, Chuggy.
And I'm Mark. Thanks.
I've been your host, Daniel. See you next time.
This has been the TCG Compass Podcast, presented by Ambr Grading. Thanks for listening. You can find us at ambergrading.com/TCG Compass, at Ambr Grading on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, or drop us an email, tcgcompass@ambergrading.com.